you describe to me, I can clearly understand what being vegan is and honoring life in that way and not looking at it as meat on your table or something. But can you describe to me how that fits into what you're calling the big picture, especially when we think in terms of people murdering each other in this country and in other countries in such terrible ways?
Yeah,
Like, how is it all connected?
right. What I've discovered actually is that what seems to be just a relatively insignificant thing, like just the meals that we're eating. We eat 3 times a day. We don't think about it too much. We're eating while we're driving. We're eating while we're having a business meeting or while we're watching television. We just eat because we need to eat and get some energy. But what I've realized is, first of all, anthropologists understand that the most powerful way any society transmits its values from generation to generation is through rituals, and that the most powerful ritual in any society are the meals that people share, and that if you look deeply into the meals of any society, you're looking deeply into, in many ways, the hidden underlying assumptions about the nature of reality and of our relationship with each other and with animals and nature and God, the universe, everything. So looking deeply into meals, we see actually that we are forced from the time we're little kids to participate in these rituals that are designed essentially to continue on a herding culture, a culture that's based at its core on owning animals as property for food. We don't realize that. I think that's one of the most important things to understand, that we live in a society that's oriented around owning animals and eating them. And this is we can see other herding cultures, cultures where people are, out there with their crooks and their sheep and they're herding. That's what they do. And we think, well, we're not that. We have cities and we have suburbs and, we have computers. We're not a herding culture. But we are. It's the same culture. It's just a high-tech herding culture. We're killing 75 million animals every day in the United States. And so we've created, in fact, we were born into a gigantic industrialized machine that does that reaches its tentacles everywhere, and it's hidden. It's hard to see the sheds where animals spend their entire lives by the thousands, but they have to eat a huge amount. So basically, animal agriculture is the driving force behind the outer problems that we have in the world, behind the environmental problems that we have, behind global warming, for example, climate destabilization, behind species extinction, behind rainforest destruction, behind just loss of genetic diversity, soil erosion, all these environmental, the destruction of the oceans. It takes a huge toll on our environment, but at a deeper level, it's also devastating to our society, to our culture, because in order to feed all these animals, we have to essentially allow or force other people into hunger and starvation. So there's this underlying system of inequity and injustice where some people eat so high off the hog, in a sense, that we're taking most of the grain, most of the water, most of the petroleum, and eating meat, dairy products, and eggs, while other people in the country, in the world, and in the country, don't have enough to eat. They can't pay. They don't make enough money to buy the grain. We drive up the price of grain to feed to our cows and pigs and chickens, while people go hungry. And so that kind of inequity is a driving force behind war. And then the other thing is that we have workers that have to do the work of killing all these animals, and they are traumatized. They have the highest rates of worker-related injuries, the highest rates of suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, stabbing animals all day, shocking them, kicking them, impregnating them against their will, and rape racks. This brings out the worst in people. So they're traumatized. They have what is referred to as perpetrator-induced traumatic stress disorder, and they go back into their communities very often and do terrible things. And so animal agriculture is traumatic to animals, to wildlife, to ecosystems, to workers, to hungry people. Really, it's just webs of trauma that radiate out into our relations, into the web of relations in our society, and yet it's all visible. We're told in advertisements that real people eat these foods and it's delicious and all these things. It's benevolent somehow, but it's actually not benevolent. It's very malevolent in terms of what it does to our feelings, and also in terms of what it does to the environment and to our society. But on the third thing is what it does to the inner landscape of our consciousness. Because in order to participate in the meals that we're eating, we learn as little kids, I would say, about 5 main mentalities. Number one, it's a mentality of disconnectedness. Every meal is a ritual that essentially is very effective in teaching us to disconnect the reality that's on our plate from the reality that it took to get it onto our plate. We just learn not to think about, we just say, we're eating bacon. We don't think what that poor pig went through and how she was hung upside down and her throat was slashed. And if my mother had told me that, we're having the flesh of an animal who was screaming and bleeding and we're going to eat her, I would have said, no, let's have oatmeal. I don't want to eat that. But we don't know. We hide all that. So we have a society that with every meal we practice disconnecting. And we become very good at that. And so I think what we're talking about essentially is to learn to reconnect again. It's also a mentality of reductionism, of commodification of life, of reducing beings to mere commodities, of seeing them as just objects. And so when we do that to cows and pigs and chickens and fishes, and we all know that these are beings who have interests, that really, anyone who has a dog or a cat knows that these are beings that have personalities and interests, and that their interests are to them as important to them as my interests are to me. And the same is true of these other animals. They have the capacity to feel pain, and they have social relationships, and they're afraid of being hurt or killed. But we just disregard that, and we stab and kill and harm them anyway. And so doing that essentially reduces our basic compassion and awareness. And so that's number 2. Number 3 is it's a mentality of privilege and elitism, because the subtext of every meal is that certain beings are inherently superior and other beings are inherently inferior, and it's fine for the superior beings to dominate and exploit the inferior beings. And so this mentality of might makes right again goes out into our world. And then it's also a mentality of exclusion, of entitlement, of inequity. We see in our society rampant inequity. And then finally, it's a mentality of the domination and suppression, really, of the sacred feminine. That we all have within us what I refer to in the World Peace Diet as Sophia, which is the inner wisdom that naturally yearns to love and protect and care for life. The mother who cares naturally for her baby and for her family and for the neighborhood and the community, and have a healthy home life. This basic wisdom that is especially strong in women. Men have it also, but when we're forced as little kids to just think of to just see a being as a thing, and to just eat their flesh and eat the secretions, and to impregnate them against their will, and to steal their babies, and to commit horrible atrocities continually, and not just commit those atrocities, but to also eat that, actually feed it to our children, so it becomes the very flesh of our bodies. That kind of trauma and terror and fear and anxiety and frustration, all of that suppresses our natural intelligence and really essentially creates a foundation that's guaranteed to create a competitive economic system where a wealthy elite gets wealthy from disease and war and environmental devastation, and where the masses of people, unfortunately, are unable to really think deeply and clearly about why we're living this way. So I think in many ways what veganism is about is questioning the official stories of our society, and when we do that, we begin to question why there is inequity, why there is inequity between, the pay scales of men and women, or between the way the super rich have so much and people don't have enough money to even live, and why we have environmental devastation, and why animals are being harmed. And I think the basic idea is that when we look at the problems in the world, we see that there are a number of problems. And like I've been saying, we have inequity and injustice and hunger and war and disease and so forth. And one of those problems is also cruelty to animals. But for most people, cruelty to animals is on the list of problems, but it's pretty far down on the list because they're just animals. We're humans, we're much more important, so our problems are much more important. But the whole idea here is to say, no. Our cruelty to animals actually is the biggest problem on 2 levels. Number one, it by far is the most suffering. We're killing billions of animals. We're imprisoning them, hyper-confining them the actual sheer amount of agony and despair and terror and pain far outweighs human suffering. I mean, the suffering of animals at our hands is way more, and you can't even begin to compare it. But number two, I think even more important, is to realize that our violence towards these animals is the driving force behind the problems that we're having. It actually causes the environmental and cultural and physical health problems that we have on the outer level. But even more importantly, it creates the internal set of attitudes that guarantee that we're going to have these problems and be unable to solve them.